Good afternoon to all of you. Happy Sabbath. I'm glad that you were able to make it. We have a good-sized group. Last week was pretty full, and I was hoping it would be the same today, and it's good to see that you braved the snow and the road conditions that we had. There was a German priest that lived between 1483 and 1546, and he became very much against the Catholic Church. And he was a main driver of what they called the Protestant Reformation. And his name, as you're aware, it was Martin Luther. And among other things that he became noted for was his hatred of one book in the Bible, to the point that he wished it had not been included, not been canonized like the rest of the books had. And we're going to take a brief look at that book today, and we're going to look at the fact that it does have a rightful place in the book and why it's useful for each of us. So one of the main points in this Old Testament book is actually covered in the New Testament. There's a few different points that we can pull away from this book, but the book itself is in the Old Testament. So one thing about this book is that this book in the Bible doesn't mention God once. But one of the points that I'm going to look at is in Luke 9:24, and you don't have to go there. We're going to pretty much be in this other book for the whole time, but Luke 9:24 reads as follows: "For whoever desires to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it." So I'm addressing that because it is one of the themes that we're going to look at today. So this weekend we have basically a teen weekend. We have the lock-in going on tonight. And from that point of view, I want to look at a young lady, a very beautiful young lady, and how her character and her choices had an impact quite literally on millions of people. And a lot of times we'll just look at it as a story and not realizing the far-reaching impact that she had. But the young lady that we're going to look at today is named Hadassah. So how many of you teens are familiar with the story of Esther? I think, you've been through Sabbath school for a lot of years. I think everybody here is familiar by this point with the story of Esther. We went to Branson, Missouri this year and for the feast, and I enjoyed one of the very best musical plays that I have ever seen, and it was at a place called the Sight and Sound Theater. And I know some of you were here. How many of you have seen the Esther at Sight and Sound Theater? You know what? It was so good. With the storyline was well done. The songs, the costumes, live animals on the stage, birds flying around, horses running up and down the aisles, and then 3 stages that all moved. And I would do it again in a heartbeat if I had the chance. I highly recommend it if you haven't done it. So since most of you know the main outline of the story, I'm going to briefly skim it, and then we're going to look to the main points that affect our lives and our life choices. So the book of Esther, if you were to just read it through as a story, is maybe 20 or 30 minutes long. It's not a very long read at all. And it takes place basically around the time of 480 BC. So it's in the Persian Empire as well. So we're kind of set the platform for the rest of this. Now, the nation of Judah had been conquered by the Babylonians, and all of the people had been hauled off from their homeland. Later, the Persians came and defeated the Babylonians, as is much the case throughout history. One group rises and falls. And they were much nicer to the people of Judah that had been within that empire, and they allowed them, the king Ahasuerus had allowed them to go back, if they chose, to their homeland and to rebuild it, as we know Nehemiah did. And so the story that we're looking at takes place at the capital of Persia, Shushan, and it deals with the Jews that stayed behind. Chiefly, pretty much the main character of the story, Mordecai and his niece Hadassah. So the king at the time went searching for another queen, and I'm not going to go into the backstory of that, but he had a big empire, right? And out of that entire empire of all the women, he chose this young lady. That's why I say she's a beautiful young lady. I mean, they don't give us a picture, but she must have been pretty beautiful for him to have, looked at all of these different women and then chosen her. And by this time, she had assumed a Persian name, Esther, as we know. So a major villain in this story is Haman, who hated Mordecai. But not only did he hate Mordecai, he wanted to eradicate all Jews. And we're going to look at that right now. Haman hatched a plan to take out Mordecai, by all of the Jews in the empire. So let's look at Esther 3. And if any of you are wondering how to get there, if you know where Psalms is, the one before it is Job, and the one before that is Esther. So it makes it kind of easy to find that. I use Psalms as kind of a go-to in the Old Testament to align me where everything else is. Anyway, so it's right behind Job, or before Job, that is. So Esther 3:13 we're going to go to, for starters. Esther 3:13, and the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. So basically genocide is what this individual had in mind. And it came very close to that. So at this time, this was roughly 2,500 years ago, and at this time, the world's population was roughly 100 million, give or take. And the Persian Empire was about 50 million. So basically, King Ahasuerus ruled over half the world's population, which in world history, it's pretty rare for one person to rule half the population of the earth, but he did. So seeing the dire circumstances that her uncle and indeed all the Jews were in, the bad circumstances, Esther decided to go to the king since she had been chosen queen in order to try to change things. The only problem was that it was going to the king without asking first and being invited meant death. So, and it brings me to the scripture that we turned to earlier that I read to you from Luke 9. If you're willing to lose your life, you'll find it. So that became a theme, and we're going to look at that situation in Esther. We're just going to be in Esther all day here, or at least for this message, not necessarily all day. But Esther 4, verse 16. Go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days. That's a pretty long fast. I mean, we do one day once a year, but 3 days, this was relatively significant. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So she realized that her life was on the line, but she decided to go through with it anyway. But something else in this verse is worth looking at, and that is the fact that she had all of the Jews in Shushan, the capital city, praying for this situation, for her. Not only so we remember that she fasted, but do we remember that all of these people were fasting for the same situation? Where have we heard that attitude before, this situation? Being willing to die in Daniel's 3 friends. Yeah, okay, throw us in. If we die, we die. If we don't, we don't. But we're not going to bow down. Daniel, same thing, right? He did what he worshiped God 3 times a day, and so you're clanging all your bells and whatever. I'm not going to follow through with that. You can throw me in the den, which they did. They threw him in the lion's den. So for such a time as this, let's look at Esther 4:14. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So if I recall, that was one of the songs, or at least a major theme within that Esther play that we saw there in Branson. So seeing the dire circumstances motivated her to take action and to seek God's will, even though it doesn't even mention God in here. Now, Haman's plot backfired, as we know, and he was hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. Another one, if we remember our Bibles, that suffered the fate of hanging was Judas Iscariot, right? It's a very ignominious way to die, hanging. And so, and he was betraying the Lamb of Judah, right? I mean, he had betrayed the Son of God right here on earth. And so he was also against the Jews in that way as well. So Haman wanted all the Jews to die, as we saw in Esther 3:13. But let's look at the rest of the story. Let's go to Esther 9, a little bit farther into the book here. Esther 9, verses 1 and 2. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but the opposite occurred. The exact opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them because fear of them fell upon all the people. Let's keep going to verse 6. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. Now, there's 127 provinces in this empire. Again, 50 million people. That is a lot of area for them to have this fear of the Jews come upon them. For this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. And in Shushan, the citadel, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. That was just in the capital city. So what Haman had wanted to happen was a complete reversal. So this event, about 2,500 years ago, was a pivotal event in world history. And that's one of the other themes that I want to get to here in looking at Esther. How different would the world have been if for the Lamb of Judah to be born into, if all the Jews had been wiped out by Haman? What a different story it would have been, right, when Christ walked the earth with all the Jews wiped out. The events of Esther 9 have also very far-reaching events. So, because all of Haman's friends were the leaders in all those provinces, the people, the chiefs that Haman had put there, once they were wiped out by the Jews, there was now a vacuum. So at that time, if we look at all the historical evidence, those Jews were able to ascend into positions of government, politics, business, power, banking, whatever it was. They assumed positions of power at that time, and for 2,500 years, they've been able to be leaders in the world because they weren't wiped out and because they were able to wipe out those people of power. So this leads me to another individual. So I mentioned Martin Luther at the beginning, German. There was another individual, also German, that hated the book of Esther, completely hated it. And in some cases where he was able to, he banned the reading of it and the ownership of it. But he also banned the keeping of Purim. Okay, so starting the day after Kristallnacht, you guys are familiar with Kristallnacht. It was the night of broken glass where the Germans basically declared war on all the Jews in 1938. They broke in all of their businesses and took what the Jews had and shipped them off. That's when it all began, this whole pogrom of the people that was living in the German areas, German-occupied areas. On January 30th, 1944, so, the war ended in 45, so it wasn't long before the war ended, Hitler said the following. He said, if the Nazis are defeated, then the Jews could celebrate a second Purim. So he himself made the parallel between himself and Haman. He saw the connection, that he was basically a Haman. So, and he actually got a lot farther with the whole killing of the Jews than Haman did. Let's look at Esther 9:13. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow, and tomorrow has different meanings, according to today's decree, and let Haman's sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done, and the decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. So after the war, there was a International War Crimes Tribunal. I think a lot of you are aware of the Nuremberg trials and what happened there at the Nuremberg trials. Headline in the newspapers were 12 of Hitler's top men to be hanged. 12. Remember that number. Now, one thing about it, there was one of those 12 was Martin Bormann, and they decided him to be hanged in absentia. He wasn't there. All the other ones were there captured. But Martin Bormann had actually died at the end of the war. He was one of the top guys. But he had died at the end of the war, so he couldn't be there. He was already dead. So that leaves 11. Now, there's 11 people there. Hermann Goering, who was basically the architect of the final solution, he was like the top creator of the Holocaust, he took cyanide. So he escaped the hangman's noose, leaving how many? 10. So There was one individual there that got hanged, and his name was Julius Streicher. And right before his execution, literally seconds before, he screamed out in hatred, Purim Fest, 1946. In other words, Feast of Purim, 1946. And he put the connection together of this feast that the Jews keep and what was happening at that moment, because there was 10 sons of Hitler being hung right there, and he was one of them. And he had hatred in his eyes, and he realized it right there at the last second. Now, the most successful movies that are successful, and books for that matter, they utilize something called the hero's journey, right? Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Jaws, Rocky. We're all familiar with the hero's journey in that you have the person that is the main character in the story goes through very difficult times and triumphs at the end. It's a common theme that people like to watch. Everyone likes to watch that. And Esther is a prime example of the hero's journey where they're about to die, things look dire. Basically, they triumph in the end. So it's a great book to read, even from that perspective of the hero's journey. So the takeaways in the message is, in a book that doesn't mention God once, we read of a very, very courageous young woman that wasn't afraid to risk her life, right? Death is on the line, but she did the right thing, and many others, not just her, but many others fasted for her that decision would be the right decision, and that they would be saved from this predicament. And of course, history was changed. So instead of her people being completely wiped out, they assumed places of power for the next 2,500 years. And she prayed, she fasted, she showed courage in the face of death, just like Daniel and his 3 friends. And with God's help, we can show courage, just as Esther did, because she was there for such a time as this.